Hi everyone, I hope you're all keeping well. A student of mine has sent me a photograph of a seascape and she's wondering how she would make a start. So what I've started with here is a tonal study in charcoal, just to get an idea of the different areas of darkness and bright in the painting. So I'm going to put that aside for one moment, and I'm just going to go through briefly how you start the painting, okay? So to begin with, I'm going to put on a wash of ultramarine blue. That's it here, okay? That's the tube. And I'm going to use some white spirit and some linseed oil. And I have them mixed together here in this little bottle, okay? And I have poured a little bit into this little lid. So the first job I'm going to do, and this is what you'll do on your canvas as well, is you're going to take your blue and take some mix, which is your linseed oil and white spirit mixed together, and you're diluting down your paint, and you're going to cover your canvas with this mix. The image I'm working from is about well, it works out to be about 9 inches by 6 inches proportion wise, but I mean, I could also use, for example, 12 by 8, 24 by 16 and so on, but we won't worry about that for the moment. We just try and just get the wash on right. So I don't want to go too dark with my wash, so if you put a little bit too much paint on, just use your mix of linseed oil and white spirit to dilute it down. And really, you don't want to be going any darker than that on your canvas to begin with. So now I'm putting a grid on my canvas. I've marked half, quarter, 3/4 way on each side of the canvas, and now I'm just joining the dots. Now you can use a ruler, of course, to do this. I'm just doing it by hand. I don't need to be absolutely perfect with my line, because these lines are going to be wiped away once you get your drawing in, okay? As long as each box looks pretty much the same size as the box beside it, you're okay, okay? So if you find that you're looking at one box is very large and then the box beside it is much narrower, something isn't right with your measurements. So make sure that you're measuring from one end to the other, you're halving it, and then you're quarter, 3/4. So now I'm going to begin my outline drawing, and I'm going to use a different colour. I'm going to use Payne's Grey. Okay, so there's Payne's Grey here. You could use a different type of blue. It's entirely up to yourself, but I'm using Payne's Grey so that I can differentiate between my grid lines, which are blue, and then my drawing lines, which are going to be grey. And I'm going to use my tonal study to help me get the basic shapes and information in. So things like the horizon, where the water is, where the sand is, and where the rocks are. So now I'm using my brush to put in the basic shapes that I see. That's the actual image. Finally got it printed out. My printer wasn't working right, now it is. So I'm kind of working from that, but mainly I'm working from my drawing, from my charcoal drawing. And you can see the difference between my grey lines, which are my Payne's Grey lines for the drawing, and then the blue lines are the grid lines. Okay, so I've got the basic shapes in. You can see where my sky is, the sea, sand, and then we have a collection of rocks, and we have a path down here, and there's grass, areas of grass. You can see from the picture. It's very tempting at this stage to start getting bogged down in detail, to start drawing in little rocks and rock pools and all that sort of stuff, but don't. Just treat things as big shapes for the moment. And another thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take a little bit of Payne's Grey and I'm going to use it to just block in darker areas, just so I kind of see what's what. So things like the rocks, just to remind myself where dark areas are. I'm just going to use the Payne's Grey to block in those areas so it doesn't get too confusing. So now I have a very rough tonal study using the Payne's Grey oil paint. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take a dry rag now. Don't use baby wipes or anything with oil on it, because what I want to do is I want to wipe away any grid lines. I don't need these grid lines anymore. And remember, if you're painting your canvas or you're painting dries and you haven't the grid lines wiped away, they will come through. Sometimes they'll come through the paint, especially if you're using transparent colours. Okay. Now I have wiped away my grid lines, and now I'm thinking about colour. So starting off, I've been doing a little bit of experimenting along the side there with my palette, and we'll go through the colours on the left hand side. So starting off, I have cobalt blue, and then cobalt blue with some white, and cobalt blue with some more white. So we might think about those colours for our sky and water, maybe with a little bit of viridian hue mixed in for the water at a later stage. Going to the sand, I'm looking at, it's very bright, but maybe a white with a little bit of burnt sienna. This is burnt sienna on its own, and then this is burnt sienna with some cobalt blue mixed with it, which I can use for the dark areas on the rocks. And then I also have sap green, and sap green with a little bit of yellow ochre, which again I'm going to use for the grassy area and maybe the distant hillside as well. So really we're talking about cobalt blue, burnt sienna, sap green, yellow ochre and white. So that's 5 colours, and that's plenty. Don't go putting out loads of colours, 12, 13 colours, life gets too confusing. Here's my messy palette, and I'm going to start with some sky colours. So I've got some cobalt blue here, and I've got some white up here. So we're going to start by taking a clean palette knife, taking some paint out, cleaning our knife, adding white to it, and we've got a kind of a mid to light blue. Could take another little bit, clean my knife again, and I'm taking white to maybe get 2 tones of the same blue. So a lighter blue and a darker blue, and I'm always kind of inclined to mix in small amounts just to keep control of things. You know, you should see a fair difference between the 2 blues. And remember, also another thing you can do is if you're looking for a blue, I've got paint on my palette knife, I hold it up to the image and I'm picking up colour there now around the bottom of the sky, so that's not so bad. So I'm blocking in the sky. I've already applied a darker tone up top. I don't want to apply the same, you know, flat colour everywhere, so I'm applying a lighter tone of blue underneath, and I'm leaving a slight gap between my 2 shades of blue, because what I can do is I can go back and blend both at the end, just really loosely and roughly. You know, it gives a little bit of movement and then kind of energy to the sky. Don't overwork it, don't over brush the sky. At this stage, you know, this is the early stage. I'm only just applying my first layer of paint, and what I might also do is I'm just taking a little bit of kind of white on the brush as well, and I'm going to just put this on at the bottom because there's a hint of sort of clouds in the lower areas of the sky. So a little bit of white into the wet paint and leave it be. Now I'm working from top to bottom with this painting, so I'm on to kind of the distant hills now, and I'm just adding touches of, it's a mixture of sap green and yellow ochre, just to kind of block that in. I work from top to bottom because remember, if I'm working from bottom to top, there's a tendency for your sleeve to drag some wet paint upwards and kind of ruin what you have. So I'm just blocking in my sap green and yellow ochre here, nice and loosely. You know, details I'll come back on in the next layer. Okay, so I'm just blocking in the beach now. I'm using burnt sienna with a little bit of white, and don't forget to, you know, pick a brush that suits what you're doing. So if you're working in a small area, use a small brush, big area, bigger brushes. And also remember that brushes, you know, different colours can be used in different brushes. So at the moment I've got a blue brush and I've got a green brush, and now I've got a kind of a pale brush, and I might give them in a wash in a little while. Now I'm blocking in the rocks in the foreground, and even though some of them are quite pale in places, I am just giving them all a kind of a base coat of a dark brown. So that's my cobalt blue mixed with my brown. And stroke wise, you know, when I'm painting water, for example, I'm going to cross like that. Whereas the rocks are more kind of chunky and lumpy. So I'm sort of going up and down, almost scratching strokes with the brush. Looking in the grass, and I notice in the picture that there's areas in the grass that, you know, you've a lot of strong greens, and then you have more yellowy greens. So what I'm doing is I'm dipping into maybe my yellow ochre on its own in places, and kind of throwing that in with the green, and then dipping into my sap green, and also just throwing that in and kind of bringing them together, mixing them on the canvas rather than on the palette. It can be fun to do as well. Okay, I'm blocking in the little path, the sand path in the foreground. I'm using a mix of burnt sienna and white. My colour is slightly darker than the photograph, and my stroke is kind of over and back. You can imagine people constantly walking along this path, and they kind of, it's almost tunnel-like in that it's lower than the grass. So just working my way along, blocking that in. I'm not using any oil at this stage, because remember, we've put on a wash and the oil is already on the canvas. Now I have the main areas blocked in, and what I can start to do now is to look at detail. So I dealt with the big areas first. Every area got a kind of a general sort of a blocking in before I started concentrating on details. But what I'm going to do first is, I have 4 very dirty brushes here, so I'm going to go and clean them with some olive oil and some soap. So olive oil first, and the olive oil will draw out all the dirty paint out of your brush. Just use a rag to wipe the brushes, and then once you've got all the oil paint out of your brush, use a little bit of soap and water to get rid of the olive oil or vegetable oil, whatever you have. So now my brushes are clean, and I'm going to focus on kind of smaller details. So the first thing I notice is that I've got darker bluish clouds close to the hills. So I'm using a small brush, and what I'm going to do is just take some cobalt blue on the brush and just work my way along. The paint is still a little wet, and that's actually no harm, because the darker blues blends into the colour underneath nice and naturally, so it just looks nice and soft. So I'll just work my way along. Now I'm going to put in some white highlights so that I can see in the clouds little hints of white. So just keeping an eye on the picture here and there. Just going to dab in some touches of titanium white. Again, the paint is wet, so it sits in quite nicely into what's there. And just here and there, just always be careful of white. White is a very powerful colour, can be quite strong, so just touches of it really is all that you need. Now I'm going to use some dark to highlight the lower areas on the distant landscape. So I'm using this colour here, which is a mixture of burnt sienna and cobalt blue, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to use it along the base of the hill here near the water to just create more contrast, more darkness at the bottom of the hill where it meets the water. I'm not doing a continuous line, it's sort of here and there, picking my spot and just adding it in over here. And in a minute then I'm going to be adding little highlights on top of this to describe sort of the little rocks that you can see. Okay. Now I'm just using a little bit of light grey to highlight the tops of the darks that I put in. Again, just here and there, little spots of light that you can see in the photograph. Don't overdo it. I'm working into wet paint, so I have to kind of wipe the brush every so often, go back, and I'm using that light grey, which is made from the burnt sienna cobalt blue, which makes that black, and then a little bit of white gives us the grey. So now I'm going to add some white highlights on the beach, just to brighten it another little bit. I am not going to cover the beach in white. I'm just picking certain areas and just brightening them. Find when you brighten an area beside an area of dark as well, you get more contrast and kind of more impact. So just working my way along, just here and there. Also maybe lower down in between the rocks again, and eventually I will be putting little highlights on this path so just to take the flatness off it, but I also would need to have another look at that path and put in some darker little spots as well. I've mixed some Viridian, which is this colour here, and some cobalt, which is here, and some white together, and I've got this colour which I am going to use on my water. There's just this gorgeous sort of turquoise glow off the water, so I'm using this maybe over the dark to blend over the dark, and to, I suppose, lighten the water a little bit. Always with water, with this sort of still water, my stroke is across, okay, to keep the flatness, a little bit of movement in it, no harm as well. At a later stage I'll also need to put on a little highlights, little touches of highlights for the foam here at the water's edge. Now I'm using a small brush and I'm using white, and I'm putting in little highlights of the tide coming in, okay, and the water breaking on the shore. Excuse me. So I sort of skip a bit, add a few touches, skip another bit, add a few touches, and leave it at that. When you are putting in highlights, it's often no harm to put a little bit of shadow underneath the highlight to, I suppose, intensify it, to create more contrast. So I'm using a little bit of dark cobalt, and I'm just putting a little hint of it underneath those highlights that I've just added. Rocks are very dark and very flat, so when you look at the photograph you can see all sorts of patterns and lighter areas on them. So I have mixed on my palette a lighter, you wouldn't call it a grey, it's kind of in between a brown and a grey. So I started with my burnt sienna and my cobalt blue, and I added white, and it's a sort of a dirty kind of a tan colour, and I'm going to use that now to highlight some of the lower areas of the rock where we see that kind of a burnt sienna, rust colour, grey, and so on. So here we go. So just here and there, again, the paint is still wet, so it's actually quite nice because it sort of sits in a little bit better and it's more natural. The only thing I have to watch is I pick up dark paint as I'm putting down light paint, so I have to wipe my brush every so often. Go back and get another little bit, and I just work my way along, picking out highlights, maybe even rocks that are in the foreground that are that little bit lighter than the ones behind them, so I can be a little bit more generous. I'm even using a little bit of white paint now on top of that. On I go again, touches here and there, because the white will come out at us and the dark will go back. So I'm just trying to break up this section of darkness. So I've started to lighten some areas of the rocks and take that very flat dark look off them, but you can see from the picture that, you know, some of them are very bright. So I have just pure white on my brush now, and I can highlight certain rocks. So bear in mind this has gone into kind of wet paint. So I put on a few little touches, and I'm going to wipe my brush, go back and get a little bit more paint, a little bit more white paint, and on I go just to highlight that particular rock. Maybe some of the other ones I'll need to also highlight with a little touch of white. As the white hits the wet paint, you know, it doesn't remain a pure white for too long. The more I move it around, it'll pick up some of the wet colour underneath. So the trick at this stage is, as well, is, you know, we use small brushes because there's only so much paint you can put on with small brushes. And also every so often get up from your seat and stand back from your work. So I'm going to do a little bit of work on the grass, and what I'm doing is I'm using sap green and cobalt blue together to add some shadows to the grass, or darker little touches here and there. I am also going to highlight it in a little while, but I just feel that it could do with a little bit more kind of movement, or something else happening in it. There are also things like there are daisies and so on, but really I want to get my darks sorted first before I start putting on lighter colours. I'm also noticing that the grass here it's quite short and kind of bare, and you can even see little touches of earth through the grass. So I'm using the burnt sienna again to break up the green, I suppose. Really, you know, green can be a difficult colour to sort of deal with. So I'm just introducing little bits of burnt sienna into this foreground area, just again to break up the green a little bit. I'm also going to use a little bit of yellow ochre and then a few little white spots for our daisies, and that should give more life to this area. I'm also bringing a little bit more darkness into where the path is, where the lightness of the path meets the grass. You're going to get, like, you can see little bits of shadow here and there on it, and it also just breaks up that line, covers the original drawing line, and it just looks a little bit more natural if maybe some of the little blades of grass or tufts of grass are actually coming in on the path a little bit more. So now I'm just adding little highlights of white to the path. The paint is still wet here, so the white sinks in quite nicely into the sand. Okay. I'm also adding darker little touches, maybe where people have walked and they've left sort of footprints behind. So don't be too regimented with this, kind of very random little marks here and there. Don't let it become a pattern. I'm also going to add some white highlights. They're like little daisies or little flowers that are sprinkled all along the grass there in the foreground. Don't overdo it, just here and there, little dots, okay? So they're little they're little figures on the beach. So if I was to have a go at doing one, I have a small brush, I have a little bit of grey paint on the brush, and I'm just going to start with the body maybe. So there's the body. I'm picking up paint as I work, so I have to kind of clean my brush on a dry rag. The head is slightly stooped forward, so his head is around there, and just sort of one leg in front of the other. Like it's really very much in the distance. He's tiny, so you don't see that much detail. Maybe a little hand coming through. Okay, and there's another person behind the rock, if you want to put that in, or maybe what we might do is we could put him closer to the first figure. So I'm just, again, body, torso, and just a hint of legs. So finally I have given my two little figures red and green swimming trunks. So that is my interpretation of the beach in Ballyconneely. And you know, I'm not trying to get every single detail. in the painting. It's a quick enough study, and I hope you enjoyed it, and you can like this video or whatever it is you're meant to do on YouTube these days. Okay, thank you, bye bye.